Two hunters in the same drainage, same pressure, same elk. One of them spends the week reacting, bumping animals, burning setups, wondering why bulls hang up or vanish before he ever gets a shot. The other hunter fills his tag on day 3. One of the possible differences here is that one of them understands what the terrain is actually doing, where it's moving the wind, where it's funneling the elk, where it's controlling the sight lines, where it's creating the approach route that keeps his scent out of the equation completely. The mountain is not neutral. We know that, right? It's either working for you or against you. This video is about how to make it work for you. Here's the problem that a lot of elk hunters have with terrain. They think about it as a place to hunt. They navigate it, they move through it, they set up in it, but they don't use it the way that an elk thinks about it. Terrain isn't just the ground you're standing on, it's a system of wind channels, sightline breaks, sound corridors, movement funnels, scent traps, and approach highways. And every one of those features is either working in your favor or costing you encounters. Hunters who understand what terrain is actually doing make fewer mistakes. They create fewer blown setups, and they close on more bulls. Now, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game across multiple states for 34 years. I've also spent more than 30 years as a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach, and many of my earlier years competing as an elite athlete. In every performance domain I've ever been in, the athletes who win aren't always the most gifted. They're the ones who use their environment better than the competition. And in elk hunting, the environment is the terrain. Here's how to use it. Before you can use terrain as a weapon, you need to understand what it's actually controlling, because it's controlling more than a lot of elk hunters realize. Terrain controls wind direction, not just horizontally, but vertically, right? The shape of a canyon, a ridge, or a saddle determines how air moves through it and how your scent is going to travel within it. Terrain controls thermals, the angle of a slope, the direction it faces, and the amount of timber or cover it actually holds. That all determines how quickly it warms in the morning and cools in the evening. And that temperature change drives the vertical movement of air that carries your scent up or down depending on the time of day. That's a thermal. Terrain controls elk movement. Elk don't walk randomly through a mountain. They use the path of least resistance through terrain that gives them security. Specific saddles, specific creek crossings, specific bench edges. They do this predictably and repeatedly because the terrain doesn't change. Terrain controls sight lines. A timbered ridge between you and a bull means he can't see your position until he's already committed. Open flat ground means he can see you from 300 yards and hang up before he's ever close enough. The hunter who reads the terrain for all of those variables and more simultaneously is the hunter that the mountain is going to work for. Now, the weapon gets loaded before you ever leave camp. Terrain reading starts on a topo map or satellite layer, and the hunters who do this well arrive in the mountains with a significant advantage over anybody driving trailheads trying to figure out and find a starting point. The features that matter most for us as elk hunters are saddles, benches, drainages, points, and aspect. Saddles are terrain pinch points. They're where ridgelines dip and elk cross from one drainage to another, consistently, predictably, year after year. Find a saddle connecting two drainages with elk use on both sides, and you've found a natural ambush point that doesn't require calling or luck. Benches are where elk feed and bed in mid-elevation country a lot of times. A flat or gently rolling slope shelf cut into a steep hillside is going to give elk a place to rest with visibility below and escape terrain above. Those are the features that show up on satellite imagery as slightly lighter, flatter areas within steep terrain. Drainages funnel both elk and air, their travel corridors and scent channels simultaneously. Understanding which direction a drainage drains and how air moves through it is critical before you ever set foot in it. Study those features first. The mountain is going to confirm what the map suggested. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Now, thermals are probably the most misunderstood and most exploitable terrain feature in elk country, and they're completely predictable if you understand the mechanics behind them. Now, as terrain heats in the morning, air rises, right? Thermals carry your scent uphill at that point. As terrain cools in the evening, that air falls, so thermals pull your scent downhill. At mid-morning, when the thermal cycle transitions between rising and falling, air becomes swirling and unpredictable, and that's the window when a lot of hunters get burned without knowing why. That happens both in the morning transition and the evening transition. Now, here's how you use this as a weapon. In the early morning, before the sun has heated the slope, your thermals are still going to be falling, right? Which means you need to make sure that you're below those elk. When the sun starts to warm that slope and you get those rising thermals, you need to make sure that you're then approaching from above the elk. In both scenarios, side hilling can work very well as well. In the evening, you've also got to watch out for those shifts, right? In the late afternoon, you're still going to have those rising thermals. And then as shade starts to hit the slope, you're going to have the downhill thermals. So you've got to adjust accordingly. So you want to make sure that you're setting up above or below, depending on which direction that thermal's coming from, or at least from the sides, right? From the side slope position. Now, terrain shape intensifies all this, right? A tight canyon funnels thermal movement in predictable lanes. A wide open basin lets it swirl more. A north-facing slope heats slower and produces weaker thermals than a south-facing slope in the same drainage. The elk hunter who understands those variables isn't hoping the wind cooperates. He's using terrain to control exactly where his scent goes and when. Now, a mature bull approaching a sound wants to see the source before he commits, right? That's not a preference. It's a survival behavior built into every elk that has lived through a hunting season. If he can see the location the sound is coming from and nothing about what he sees adds up, he's going to stop. The hang up. If he can't see the source yet everything else feels right, he might keep closing. That's the difference. Visible versus non-visible, right? Is entirely within your control throughout the setup position. Now, the weapon here is any terrain feature that breaks his sight line, right? A timbered ridge between you and his approach route, a bench edge that drops off sharply in front of your position, a boulder field, a point of timber that forces him to come around a corner before he can confirm what's making that sound that he heard. Give him a route that requires him to close the distance in order to get eyes on the source. The moment he steps around that timbered point or crests that bench looking for the elk he heard, he's probably already inside the right bubble. The sight line is a controllable variable, so use the terrain to control it. If there is a single terrain feature worth understanding better than any of these others, it's probably the funnel. Any natural pinch point that compresses elk movement into a predictable, repeatable lane. Saddles are funnels. A low point in a ridgeline connecting two drainages is going to see elk traffic every time those animals move between them, regardless of pressure, regardless of rut phase, regardless of elk season. Elk that have been bumped out of one drainage don't disappear. They cross a saddle. And if you're you're waiting at that saddle with the wind right and a clean setup on the approach side, you're hunting with the mountain doing most of the work. Creek crossings are funnels. In timber terrain with a drainage running through the bottom, elk cross at specific points determined by the bank angle a lot of times, the timber density, and even the depth of the water. So by finding the crossing points, you found a consistent movement lane. Bench edges are funnels. As elk move from timber to feed or from feed back to security, they travel along the edge of terrain breaks, using the flat ground or the bench while keeping the slope and its escape terrain within a few steps. Try to identify every funnel you can in your hunting area before season, then figure out which ones you can approach with the wind and a clean exit. Those are going to be prime locations for you. Getting to your setup undetected is just as important as the setup itself, and terrain gives you the tools to do it cleanly if you read it right before you move. The principle here is that elk use terrain for security, so you use terrain for concealment on your approach to that security. Both of you are using the mountain. The difference is what you're asking it to do. Ridgeline approaches are going to let you stay on the opposite side of a slope from the elk before targeting, keeping your scent and sound below the ridgeline until you're in position. Drainage approaches allow you to walk in a creek bottom with moving water masking your sound and the air usually pulling your scent away from the bench above. Timbered points give you cover to move behind while staying off the skyline. The approach route matters as much as the setup location, maybe even more a lot of times, because a compromised approach educates elk before you ever get into position. A clean approach delivers you to the setup unannounced with all your advantages still intact. So plan the approach on the map before you move. Identify where you're going to be skylined, where the wind is going to work against you, where the terrain breaks allow you to drop below the line of detection. Walk that route in your head before you walk it with your boots. Now, the way sound behaves in terrain is something a lot of elk hunters never think about, and it's costing them setups they should be closing on. Sound carries differently depending on the terrain you're actually calling in. A tight canyon can amplify and funnel calling in a specific direction. A bull on the receiving end hears volume and location really clearly, which can work for you or against you depending on where he is relative to the canyon walls. Now, an open basin dissipates sound, so your calls lose volume really quickly and a bull at distance receives less convincing information. So you want to start your calling sequence when you're inside the bubble and it's appropriate with that in mind, right? Usually calling uphill into the drainage or across. But timber can also change this calling equation. A bull in heavy timber hears less distance and less direction in your calls, which means he's more likely to commit without the full picture he'd get in more open terrain. So call from the edge of the timber into open country and you're giving him more information than he needs. Call from within the timber and you're forcing him to close the distance and find the source while being protected by the sight line that we talked about earlier. Elevation is one of the most underused terrain weapons in elk hunting, and the mechanics behind it are pretty simple once you understand them. Getting above elk changes the thermal equation in your favor when the thermals are rising, right? Morning thermals, once they're rising, once that slope is warm, is going to allow the hunter to position above those elk and have his scent carry away from the elk that are below, not into them. So that's the opposite of what a lot of elk hunters do, though. They approach from below or just any way that's convenient because it's physically easier, and they give up the thermal advantage before the setup even starts. Elevation also changes the calling equation, right? Sound from above carries downhill with clarity and volume, but that bull below you, he might feel more nervous because you're above him when he's coming in there. So take those things into consideration when you're planning that setup. Sound from below can be easier to sell sometimes because he has the positional advantage. Now, for folks who can use glassing as a tool, the sightline advantage of elevation is just as significant, right? From elevation, you can glass more country, identify movement sooner, and read elk behavior before committing to an approach. The hunter on the high ground sees the whole board. The hunter in the bottom is guessing and has a much harder time seeing what's above. Earning elevation costs something physically, but that's exactly the point. The terrain that requires effort to reach is the terrain that a lot of elk hunters skip, which means the elk on the other side of that climb have seen significantly less pressure. So get above the country, then view it from up there, and it's going to change everything. A terrain is not the background of the hunt, right? It can be the weapon, and it's available to every elk hunter willing to learn how to read it. Control the thermals with your approach timing. Use funnels to put yourself in the lane before the elk arrive. Break the sight line so bulls commit before they confirm. Plan your approach route so the mountain keeps your presence invisible. Understand how sound behaves in the terrain you're calling in, and get into the country that you can see best from. Earn the elevation and let it do the work that a lot of elk hunters never get to access. The mountain is always working. The only question is whether it's working for you or against you. And that's a choice, and now you know how to make it yours. If this episode made you realize you need a better elk plan this season, don't just watch another video and hope it all comes together. Build your plan right now. If you want to study the full elk system on your own, start with my elk hunting series of ebooks. If you want daily guidance, accountability, and a place to ask questions as season gets closer, join me on Team Backbone. If you want my eyes on your actual hunt plan, your maps, your access, terrain, pressure points, wind and thermals, and your strategy, book an elk hunt plan audit with me and I'll help you tighten it up before season. If the missing piece is your body, your legs, your lungs, and your ability to handle mountain miles and a heavy pack, check out my Backbone Unlimited training plans. And if nutrition is where you need more structure, getting leaner, fueling long days, or building a better in-season food plan, check out my nutrition plans. The hunters who are ready in September are the ones who start tightening their plan right now. So go to backboneunlimited.com, choose the path that fits where you are, and I'll help you get started. Thanks for being here. I appreciate each of you. I'll see you in the comments. I look forward to seeing those. You know I read and respond to all of them. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.